and I won't make you move or write them down, but just think about them. So if we were going to move, we'd have a spot in the room. Over here is always enough. In the middle is sometimes enough, and that side is never enough. Okay, so I want you to think about your relationship to these words. You don't have to write it down. You don't have to move. You don't have to raise your hand. Just think about where you would go. Always enough, sometimes enough, never enough. In relationship to money. Always enough, sometimes enough, never enough. How about time? What's your relationship with time? Always enough, sometimes, never enough. Love. Food. Joy. Always, sometimes, never. Forgiveness. You don't have to raise your hand, but did you answer always enough to even 1? Or 2? Or 3? Did anyone answer always enough to all the words, all 6? Our life has limitations. Our world has limits. We know this so well that we, as counselors, rarely, we tell people don't use the word always. Nothing is always, and yet in the kingdom of God, it's so much different. It throws everything we know about limits on its head. We know about limits from things like sports. Think about all the limits and restrictions in sports. 3 strikes, you're out. Called for face masking. Penalty kick. Delay of game. You even get ejected if it goes far enough. False start. Unsportsmanlike conduct. Penalty box. And juicing. We know about limitations, and we want those limitations. None of us would sit through a baseball game if they got to have 5 strikes. We like the limitation. It gives us clear boundaries, and it makes sense to us, and right is right. So if you have 3 strikes, you're out, and you go sit down, and the next batter comes. We know about parameters in regards to grades, employment, awards, aging, and most, or if not all of our relationships. And then Jesus shows up. Then Jesus shows up on the scene, and Jesus shows up in our gospel story at Simon's house. And we witness grace, and we witness those limits being broken. Because the rules that we love so much, even in regards to God's love, are thrown out the door. The people are gathered, and they're still trying to work with their bookkeeping system of sins, right? They keep track. This woman is never given a name in this gospel. She's a sinner. That's her name, sinner. They love their bookkeeping. Let's keep track of sins and pile them up and keep them counted and know that you have more than me, and that makes me so much better, especially these Pharisees who were the keeper of the law. They love their bookkeeping system, and they did it very well. That they can't even see grace and mercy as this woman is weeping and anointing and kissing and saying, I need someone other than these laws because these laws are killing me. She stands in the presence of the one named Grace, and she gets it, and the rest stand in their self-righteousness. It's interesting that the words that we translate debt, guilt, and sin are the same word in Sanskrit, Hebrew, and Aramaic. It can be literally translated what is owed. So think about that when we pray the Lord's Prayer. Forgive us what is owed as we forgive those who owe. Think about all the times you hear the words guilt or debt or sin, what is owed. We know this so well, and yet we love to keep track. And we sometimes can be like Simon. He didn't even know he was in debt. He was the rule keeper. He was the one who was showing hospitality. He was a Pharisee. He didn't even realize that he owed something. He was so busy being self-righteous he couldn't see it. And the guests who were gathered around that table presumed to know who this woman was and what she had done, and they almost were delighted in that at least I'm not as bad as she is. There is always enough grace and forgiveness, even for us, when we stand in judgment of others. Jesus meets each and every person in that room where they are. Call it people smart, call it intuition, call it emotional intelligence. Jesus demonstrates to each person that there is enough for them. Even in that parable he tells Simon, "You're a debtor." I don't think Simon realized that. And Simon gets caught up in the story and realizes, oh yes, I too am in need of God's love, and there's always enough forgiveness even for me. Jesus reverses in this gospel reading the idea that there's penance and then forgiveness. That you have to first say you're sorry. This woman comes and all she knows is she's desperate. She's desperate for someone to save her. But she doesn't ask for that. We never hear this woman speak. Instead, she washes his feet. She kisses his feet. She covers them with ointment. And Jesus forgives her before she can even say she's sorry. He reverses it. And that's vital because these Pharisees were such bookkeepers. He reverses it. And what does he say to her? You're saved. You're free. You're free. And then she goes out and lives a life of love. That Jesus forgives. He covers it all. The debt is paid. Get over it already. I don't know about you, but I spend a lot of my life trying to figure out how I can make up for the mistakes. Instead of hearing the words, you are free, you are forgiven, let it go already, God has. You are free, you are set free, go and live as a free person. Simon loves to point out how socially inappropriate she is, right? She's kneeling at his feet and he says, look at her. She's a sinner. What are you doing, Jesus? I think how many times we are tempted to do the same, and Paul warns us in Galatians. He says, don't take grace and make it law. Don't take God's gift and make it into a law. We try so hard sometimes with church membership, with communion, with baptism, with forgiveness. The gifts of God we try to make into law, and Paul says, absolutely not, or there is no point in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Take the grace and live into it as free people. Dan Gilbert wrote a book a few years ago called Stumbling Onto Happiness, and happiness isn't just giddy, it's contentment and peace. He has a YouTube video, or a TED Talk I'd recommend to you, about the secret of happiness. He tells stories of various people. Some of them you may know, some you may not. Some of you may remember Jim Wright. He was the chairman of the House of Representatives. He was the leading Democrat in the country. And then this upstart, this new young guy came on the scene, Newt Gingrich, and he pointed out that Wright had a very shady book deal. Wright lost everything. He lost his position, his power, his standing in the community. He lost a lot of money. Years later, he was interviewed and he said, I am better off mentally, emotionally, financially, in any way possible because of that experience. Maurice Bickman was in prison for 37 years for a crime he didn't commit. 37 years. He was released at age 78 because of DNA testing. And when he was released, he was interviewed, and they asked him about his experience, his impressions. His answer was, I don't have 1 minute's regret, it was glorious. He didn't say the gym was okay, I met a few nice guys. He said it was glorious. That's usually reserved for religious experiences. You might have known the name Harrison Lagerman. In 1949, you read about this little hamburger stand in the newspaper. And it seemed to be taking off, and he thought about investing. So he called these brothers, whose last name was McDonald, and he asked what it would cost to buy a franchise. And at that time, it would cost $3,000. So he went home to New York and asked his brother if he'd give him half the money so they could invest. His brother's response was, you idiot, no one eats hamburgers. A couple of months later, Ray Kroc thought it was a good idea too and invested. Some of you may know the name Pete Best. He was the original drummer with the Beatles. They fired him, And he did go through some depression, and he actually sued them for defamation. But in 1994, he was interviewed, and he said not being a part of the Beatles was the best thing that happened to me in my life. Now, are these people just naive? Are these people idiots? How could they say these things after such terrible circumstances? What Dan Gilbert claims is that happiness comes not from our circumstances. Because if we looked at these things, we'd say, what you should do is gain wealth and power and prestige and then lose it all. Or you should help someone else get rich. Or you should spend as much of your life in prison as you can. Or you should never join the Beatles. What Dan Gilbert has discovered in thousands and thousands of interviews is the people who have the understanding that they live in mercy and grace, that they are not no more or no less than what's happened to them, are the people who truly live as free people. We make this claim all the time as children of God, that we are no more or no less than what we have done or what has been done to us. And instead, we stand in the grace and mercy of God constantly. And we stand in some dark places. And from that, we find God is present. And God is always doing a new thing. And my circumstances do not dictate my contentment or peace. Instead, we find a God who is with us in all and every circumstance. The great poet and prophet Wendell Berry has written, we must live the given life in the given world. Not headline news, but I think Jesus is saying this in our gospel. I think the psalmist echoes this with words of I am sorry, and please forgive me, and yet you impute no guilt. You do not hold me as a guilty person. Instead, you liberate me and call me free. I'd like to close with words from an Irish blessing entitled, May You Have Enough. May your joys be as bright as the morning, and your sorrows merely be shadows that fade in the sunlight of love. May you have enough happiness to keep you sweet, enough trials to keep you strong, enough sorrows to keep you human, enough hope to keep you happy, enough failure to keep you humble, enough success to keep you eager, enough friends to give you comfort, enough faith and courage in yourself to banish sadness, enough wealth to meet your needs, and one more thing, enough determination to make each day more wonderful than the day before.